So let me introduce myself here real quick. So my name is Tony Uma, and I'm a senior solutions architect based out of Nashville, Tennessee. As John mentioned, we are right now verticalized, but I myself have been supporting healthcare customers for quite a while. I've been with AWS right now for over 5 years. And just to give you a background of my technical skills, I'm a software engineer by training, but over my career, I've had multiple roles. I've worked with startup companies in telecommunications. Right now, I'm working with healthcare customers, specializing in generative AI, fine-tuning models, building generative AI applications. And I'm really excited today to talk about one of the very interesting use cases that I'm currently working on with some of our largest customers, which is clinical trial. So
Tony, one question, and I'm sure this is covered by or of interest to a number of people, concerns when you go through this example. And Patrick, I'm going to unmute you. He had a question, and you can expand on this. When you're using this, how do you make sure patient data, HIPAA data, Social Security data, et cetera, is kept secure? Is there anything else you want to add, Patrick? Or maybe Patrick doesn't have a microphone. Oh, there you go, okay. Patrick.
Sorry about that. Yeah, not a lot to add to that. Just kind of that's the general question, but want to make sure if you use generative AI, how is that kept, that information that it considers kept from being publicly available for other generative AI sources?
And where do you work at, Patrick? Just so we could cover that.
Pardon me?
Where do you work at, just to help put that in context?
Intelligent. We do care management, case management, population health management in general overall.
All right, great. Let's go through it, Tony, and I'm sure you're going to cover that during your presentation.
Well, so security is obviously a separate topic, but I can quickly answer that question if you don't mind. Obviously in AWS, security is our #1 priority, right? And when we're building these services, we are not building it for POCs, we are building it actually for production. And when we talk about production data, privacy and security is the #1 thing that customers care about, because obviously, this is our health data, this is our PII, and we don't want to compromise that data, or that data ending up in someone else, AI model which might end up leaking to the public. So in the context of Bedrock, right? Bedrock is a fully managed service. And in AWS, obviously, there's something we call shared responsibility model, which you as a customer, you control the data, you own the data, and you control who has access to that data. However, from architecturally, Bedrock doesn't use the data that you send to the model for inference. In this case, for example, if you're trying to do predictions, or you're trying to do generative, generate text in this case, or doing summarization, the model itself is not using that data for training. It's just using it for inference. It's essentially just doing some, don't want to get too technical, but it's just a bunch of matrix multiplications under the covers, and it gives you an answer. It doesn't save that data anywhere. It doesn't have either a short-term memory or a long-term memory where it saves that data. That data literally stays in your own environment, in this case, your own AWS account.
And for Patrick, what's that, Patrick?
I was saying, no, that's good to know, because I know that's kind of been a little bit of a hesitation on our part as far as using that, as we want to make very, very sure that we don't show up on a paper headline someday.
Yep, that's a legitimate concern.
And what we will do is, for more detailed information on your specific use case, I will send a separate email out between Patrick and Tony so we can go into that in more detail.
Very good. Thank you.
Awesome. So yeah, for the sake of today's conversation, one of the use cases that we are seeing our healthcare customers think that it's a very, very good use case for generative AI is actually clinical trials. And just to level set here for folks who are maybe not from healthcare specific industry vertical, so clinical trial matching is actually a very key process in healthcare and delivery. So you want to think about clinical trials is how we are able to develop things like clinical, drug development, or just even clinical discovery, and being able to come up with different types of treatments, for example, for cancer, or even cardiovascular disease. So part of the developers of these drugs, for example, if it's pharmaceuticals and they're trying to come up with a new drug, for example, when COVID came out, we had different pharmaceuticals that was experimenting with different drugs, for example, companies like Moderna or even Pfizer. So from a clinical trial perspective, there is sort of like a pipeline that is usually involved, which is, number one, we want to identify the patients that we think are going to be a good fit for a specific clinical trial process. But before we even jump into what that pipeline is, let's talk about some of the challenges that actually exist today from a clinical trial point of view. And if you look at this chart here, and I do have the references for white papers on this in these slides, and which I believe will be shared after this presentation, is that part of patient matching, or in this case, is called accrual, is a challenge, right? Because it's a very difficult process being able to identify patients who actually might be a good fit for our clinical trials. And in this presentation that I'm going to do today to show you how generative AI is able to address this problem, this is exactly what we are going for, which is the accrual piece of it, which is being able to match patient with individual clinical trials. So there are thousands and thousands of clinical trials out there today for different drugs and different diseases. And the challenge right now is being able to find patients that actually are a good fit for those trials and being able to reach out to those patients and continue additional vetting. So I'm quickly going to talk about, just at a high level, what a typical pipeline, or what, I'm going to call it a pipeline of what a clinical trial looks like. The first step is, first of all, you have to identify the patients, right? And when you're identifying the patients, there is a specific criteria that those patients need to meet. In clinical trial speak, there's documents that is usually associated with each and every clinical trial. These documents are called clinical trial protocols. One of the most important things in those clinical trial protocols is usually something we call inclusion and exclusion criteria. So these are essentially a set of requirements that the clinical trial sponsor, in this case, for example, a pharmaceutical, will put in paper and say, hey, I need these patients to be able to meet this requirement before I can be able to consider them for these clinical trials. Or if they have this specific diagnosis or these medications, they're not eligible at all. So that's what we call eligibility criteria. So in the context of this presentation, we are going to focus on the first part, which is sourcing the patient. Is number one, identifying this patient. Who are these patients, and are they a good fit? So what is the issue here, right? Identifying patients. We know we have patient data in EMR and EHR systems, right? We have all their medications, all their diagnoses, and all the diseases or illnesses that they might have. All this data is sitting in databases. But in the context of clinical trial, it's not that simple, right? In practice, you have vast amount of data. You have thousands and thousands of clinical trials. And these clinical trials, and in this context, we talk about clinical trial protocols. This is what the sponsors need for them to be able to identify patients that are eligible for these clinical trials. This is what we call a clinical trial protocols. This data is usually unstructured, right? It's literally handwritten, just natural language documents. On top of that, you have all this data that's sitting in EMR and EHR systems. This is what is available in your provider. And your provider might be or might be not be participating in the clinical trial. So all this vast amount of data, the challenge is that this data is unstructured. In practice, what we do today is that we have a persona, we usually call them clinical research coordinators. What they usually do is, and you'll see that in a minute, they usually essentially go and gather that data from the EMR systems. In this case, they're looking at the patient, they're looking at the diagnosis, they observe any medications they have, and then they're looking at the clinical trial protocol, which is the document that dictates what's the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and try to do that matching manually. That process is labor intensive, it's expensive, takes a very, very long time, and at the same time leads to the problem that we highlighted earlier, which is being able to source the patients that you need for successful clinical trials becomes a challenge because the process is just expensive and labor intensive. On top of that, it's not like in the industry, we have been trying to solve this problem for a while, and we have built systems to alleviate that problem by coming up with some very complex rules engines. But that also doesn't address the entire problem, right? Because when you think about, for example, things like patient notes or medical notes, they're handwritten by physicians, and they might have a misspelling of a drug, or maybe they might have a misspelling of a diagnosis. If you're using a rules engine, those might be missed. And at that time, you're reducing the patient pool that you might have that might have been a good fit for this particular clinical trial. So how does generative AI solve this problem? And how do you solve this in the context of AWS? So there is what we came up with, and this is the research papers, which is included in these slides of what are some sort of the frameworks that we're seeing out there of how you use generative AI to solve that. And the idea here is actually, I don't want to say simple, but pretty straightforward, right? It's an equivalent of how humans today are able to do this patient matching. Step one, you want to get the medical notes or patient notes, which is essentially information about this patient, the medications that they might have, their age, some of the illnesses that they have or diagnosis that they might have. Then on step number two, we go and get the clinical trial protocol. This is the document that the sponsor of the clinical trial actually produces for the particular clinical trial, whether it's COVID or even oncology, in this case, even cancer, for example, and they're able to leverage that. So the idea here is actually to take the medical notes, the way it is, unstructured, together with the clinical trial protocol, also same thing, unstructured, and being able to use a large language model to come up with an annotation whereby it's able to look at each and individual requirement, and this is what we call the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and come up with a relevant explanation of why it thinks, and you'll be able to see that in the demo, why it thinks that this particular, for example, in this case, one inclusion criteria is a good fit for this particular clinical trial. And then we take that prediction and we send it again to another model. In this case, it can be the same model or a different model that has been finely tuned for medical domain. And there are foundation models out there that have been domain adapted for healthcare use cases. And Bedrock does support that too. And then from there, after you get that final prediction, that's what is finally sent to downstream application. I'm going to take a pause if, John, I don't know if you're seeing any questions before I proceed to the next phase.
Yeah, there was one question. This is Ron. Let me pull this up. It's tying in, Bet Igardo with out there on the West Coast had a question, and I'm going to try and unmute him to make sure I asked this correctly. But the question was, it's good to have all of these alerts to identify or safeguards and guardrails. But are there any automatic alerts he can program to monitor the administrator as well? I don't know if Igardo, if you want to add to that. Igardo, can you unmute yourself or okay? But that's really the question, is alerts to administrators, if there's any violation of policies.
So can you configure alerts? The answer to that is yes, but obviously it depends with what type of alerts. But to answer your question, the answer is yes. So if you can add more color to that question, maybe I might be able to give you a much more detailed explanation of how you can be able to achieve that.
Got it. So the key thing is I'll do a separate email. Oh, he's driving, so he's just listening. Hopefully you answer that. I think the gist of it is all of these things can be configured not only to provide alerts directly to the administrators. And oh, by the way, you can also use generative AI to prioritize those alerts and help your security operations center and administrators take care of it. But there are also ways to have almost a secondary level of alerts where you want to monitor the administrators who are the human side of responding to that first level of alerts. And I'm sure they can be configured with your AWS account rep. Is that about right?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Let's keep going.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's take a step back and think about, okay, from an architecture point of view, right? If you were to build a patient matching application, right? What will that look like? So when you look at this application, right, we're going to start from left to right. You have the persona in our case, who is the clinical research coordinator, right? These are the folks who essentially get these clinical trial protocols from pharmaceuticals. In this case, we call them the sponsors, and they are able to essentially look at what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and be able to also look at the patient notes and be able to come up with a decision if these patients are either a good fit for a particular clinical trial or they are not. So on the left-hand side, this is a standard AWS architecture from a web application point of view, whereby the application itself is hosted in S3 with CloudFront distribution. But the key thing here is EventBridge, which is step 2. So EventBridge is an event-driven service. And the idea here is that when a clinical research uploads a clinical trial protocol, it triggers an event. And EventBridge essentially is able to route that event to different systems. In our case, typically these clinical trial protocols are usually in PDF, right? So the first step here is to digitize that PDF, a clinical trial protocol, into a structure that we can be able to leverage as far as we're sending it to downstream application, in this case, our generative AI application. So the first step here is to use another service called Amazon Extract. So Amazon Textract. So think about Textract as a fully managed OCR service. The idea behind Textract is that you can send it PDF or images, and it's able to extract that text and structure that text in a format that can be able to be consumed downstream, in this case, for example, JSON. So here, Amazon Textract essentially takes those clinical trial protocols, which in this case are PDF. We are able to get the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then from there, we actually augment the same data with patient notes, right? In this case, clinical notes from EHR systems. And the way AWS integrates with EHR systems here, in this case, for example, using FHIR format, or even if you have HL7, is to essentially using a service called Amazon Health Lake, which is a purpose-built service specifically for healthcare use cases that does support FHIR format and allows you to query FHIR resources. In this case, for example, you want to see what medications the patients have and etc. And it can handle petabytes of clinical data. So if you have a EHR systems, you send that data to Amazon Health Lake, and it's HIPAA compliant, by the way, just to emphasize on that. And we augment that data together with the inclusion and exclusion criteria. This is where the magic happens. Now that we have digitized the clinical trial protocols, right? And here we now want to take that together with the patient notes, and that's where we want to send it to a generative AI model. In this case, it's Amazon Bedrock. Amazon Bedrock essentially is a service, is an API. You as a developer or a data scientist don't need to fine-tune a model manually. You don't need to find GPUs. You don't need to configure things like learning rate. We know these things are complex, right? You get an API, you have a model that is hosted for you, and you have different options on which models you can use. We have model from Anthropic. For this particular demo and use case that I'm working with another customer, we're actually using multiple models. One of them is Cloud Opus, which we're using that, and we also have another one where we can bring in a custom model. But the idea here is once we get these inclusion and exclusion criteria, here in the compute side, we're using AWS Fargate, which is a serverless container service. That's where our code is running. And we send that to Amazon Bedrock, which is able to come up with that prediction. So essentially what you're looking at here in this box where we call step functions, we are essentially taking this framework and basically codifying it into this into Fargate compute. That's where all the code is running. And then finally, there's another service here that we use to actually enrich that output from Amazon Bedrock, which is Amazon Comprehend. And there's a very good reason why we are taking that approach, right? The idea here is that we don't want to eliminate the human in the loop. Yes, the LLM is helping make decisions or actually accelerate how quickly you're able to source good patients that might be a good fit for a clinical trial, but that's not necessarily a replacement of the human in the loop. So the clinical research coordinator, at very least now, they have a good cohort of patients that they can be able to use, compared to previously, they had to come up with very unique SQL queries to be able to find the patients that they're looking for. And that process used to take a very long time. In this case, we have automated that process where we can quickly be able to leverage the language model to basically be able to go to the patient records, come up with a patient that he thinks might be very good for that specific clinical trials, and then surface that data to the clinical research coordinator. So ultimately, the research coordinator now has all the data that they need. Number one, they have very good data of the patients that might be a good fit. On top of that, they're able to review that, and we have some form of scoring model that tells them these are the patients who are likely to be a good fit for these clinical trials or not. And now I'm speaking fast because we have 10 minutes and we have to jump into the demo. And other use cases can be analytics. You just want to understand, from a clinical trial perspective, how many patients you have, how many are fit for specific clinical trials. The architecture is sort of the same, where you have Amazon Textract and Bedrock being leveraged for that. So You gotta see it to believe it. So let's quickly jump into a demo and see what that looks like. So actually, I have a script that has been running in the background for the last few hours, and essentially what it's doing is exactly what I was just showcasing. It's reading clinical notes from EHR systems, and then it's taking that together with the digitized version of the clinical trial protocols, and then it's able to come up with a prediction. So let me show you what that looks like. So in this case, there we go. There we go. So this is my code. It's a simple Python application. And you can see here, this is the model that we're using. In this case, it's Anthropic Cloud on Bedrock. The idea here is that we are reading a specific clinical trial, and let me show you a digitized version of the clinical trials. You can see this is the title of the clinical trials. These are the drugs that is associated with these particular clinical trials. The most important part, obviously, you can see here is the inclusion criteria, and you obviously have exclusion criteria also right here. So we are taking this digitized version of the clinical trial protocol, and we are combining that with patient notes. And then finally, we're getting the model to come up with a prediction of whether that patient is a good fit for a clinical trial. And let's just take an example of some of this data that's being generated. So for example, let's pick up this particular clinical trial, and we'll be able to see what that is. So you can see here that the model was able to look at each individual inclusion and exclusion criteria. So if I go back to my slide, and I go back here, right? In each clinical trial, you have this idea of the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, and we have it numbered 1, 2, 3, 4. So here the model is able to look at each one of those inclusion and exclusion criteria and come up with a relevant explanation of why it thinks that this particular patient might be a good fit for that particular criterion in this case. So in this case, is age. Age is 18 to 65 years old. But let's look at actually the protocol itself, which I had it open here. So this is the particular protocol that I selected, right? You can see the number right there. And if you scroll down here, you can see the criteria here. This is the inclusion criteria. So the first criteria is age is 18 to 65 years old. And if we go back to our model, you can see that it say, yeah, this particular patient does meet that particular criterion. However, this is where the power of generative AI comes into play. I want you to see the second one, which is this. I don't even know what this is, right? Because of myself, I'm not a physician. You can see here that the model made a decision that, hey, I don't have enough information to make a decision if this particular patient does meet that particular criteria. And it's telling you the reason why. In the patient note, it doesn't mention anything about the patient having this particular diagnosis of schizophrenia. Apparently, that's what it was looking for. And if we go back here, that's correct, right? That's one of the inclusion criteria. So the model has actually been able to accurately say that one of the requirements for you to participate in this particular clinical trial is being able to have DSM-IV diagnosis, which in this case, our patient doesn't meet that particular requirement, right? Now, the question then becomes, Tony, you're showing us a bunch of code, which is jumbly. What exactly is being sent to the model? And how will you be able to see what's being sent to the model? So there's a tool called Langfuse. It's open source tool. And what it does, it actually captures the input and the output that goes to the model. And in this case, I have it installed in my AWS account. And actually right now, because I have my script running, you can see all the requests that are happening even right now as we speak. So for example, let's speak on this one here. You can see here that in this particular case, this is actually what we call a prompt. So the idea behind a prompt is instead of you explicitly training a model on how to do predictions, instead it's almost sort of you're giving it instructions. We call that in-context learning. And using those instructions, the model is able to come up with a prediction. And in our case, you can see here, one of the things I'm telling the model that, hey, you are a helpful assistant for clinical trial, and your task is to compare a given patient note and inclusion criteria. But the cool part about this, the programmatic part of this, is that this particular prompt, I'm dynamically generating it using code. And if you look on my script here, and where is it at? The matching engine, you can see where I'm doing that, right? You can see that the inclusion criteria, I am dynamically passing that programmatically and then feeding that to the model. And then the model comes up with a prediction. In this case, is what you see here. So in this case, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. I'm going to pause that if anyone have any question. I know I'm trying to move a little bit fast.
No, I think we're okay. I think just one general question, and maybe you can comment on this, Tony, is what happens if you go, let's say, from Microsoft onto AWS and you're using either the same LLM or trying to switch it over? How compatible is your work on one public cloud versus the other? My gut reaction is that there isn't that much compatibility if you want to go from Microsoft OpenAI and do the same thing using AWS and Anthropic. But maybe if you could comment a little bit on that.
That's a very good point. So these models, they're usually different, and versioning is actually a concern for engineers when they start building generative AI applications, right? So the way, I talked a little bit about the prompt, right? This is the prompt I'm using. The way you author the prompt is very different depending on the version of the model you're using or the type of model that you're using. So you cannot take this model, for example, and just use it, for example, on MedPalm 2, for example, GCP or OpenAI, because it's just different and it's going to behave slightly different. So to answer your question, it depends. If the model is exactly the same, for example, in this case, you're using cloud, and you, for example, use a different provider, either you go to Anthropic directly and you use the same model and the version is exactly the same, you might get the same behavior. But in most cases, maybe you might not be able to get the same behavior, just depending on different variables and etc. that you might be dealing with at the time.
Okay. I think the key takeaway, and that's one of the things we're trying to do at Angelbeat, let you get the information you need to make informed choices. But in the world of generative AI, especially at the early stages, you're not going to get the same kind of compatibility, such as moving a container workload from Google to AWS. There's much more complexity here, just to be aware of it.
Yes, that's correct. And the idea behind it is just how these LLMs work, right? They take input and they trying to predict the next token or the next word or sentence, or it's basically making a prediction based on the input that you're providing it. But as I mentioned earlier, what they're doing under the covers is a bunch of calculations, a lot of linear algebra, matrix multiplications, and etc. Right? I'm happy to jump into the deep world of that. But the idea behind it is that those calculations are very, very dependent on what we call the model weights. And those weights are very dependent on the data that the model was trained on. So if you think about from a versioning perspective, even though it's, for example, you're using it with Anthropic, in my case, I can actually show you. So in my model, if I go back here, you can see I specifically using this particular model version, right? 2024-0307, right? If Anthropic comes up with a new version, and that version maybe is not available in a different cloud provider, I'm definitely going to get a different behavior, because the model weights are not exactly the same.
All right, let's get into the demo. I think another thing, and I've seen this come up a lot, many organizations have the opportunity to deploy generative AI on their own. I call it the DIY, do-it-yourself model. Part of the value of working with AWS is leveraging people like Tony to keep abreast of different versions and to make sure your overall architecture is secure, cost-effective, as opposed to just trying to do it yourself.
That's absolutely correctly, and that's one of the things I'm very excited about my job right now, is that I get to use this awesome technology, in this case, that's transforming the lives of people. If you think about, for example, cancer patients, most of them have gone through a traditional treatment plan that is not working, and they are willing to risk their lives to experiment with new, probably something that might be able to save their lives. So if you think about a use case like this is something that is likely to save someone's life. And as a solutions architect, my job is to come up with architectures and work with customers directly. For example, if you're working with me, if you decide to work with AWS, it's going to be me, and the code that I'm writing pretty much is code that we're giving it to our customers, and then we partner with other different partners if you need to. But the idea here is to help you leverage the technology that we provide to solve some of the challenges that we face today, especially in the healthcare space. So one thing I want to add about Bedrock that makes it actually very, very unique is that the demo that I just showed you, I did not even have to fine tune the model. I used the model off the shelf exactly as is. The only thing I did was just come up with the code to actually basically actually run those predictions. But from a performance perspective, the preliminary results that we're getting on this particular use case is actually about 85% accuracy. That is almost near human level accuracy. So if you think about these CRC coordinators or the clinical research coordinators, when they have been doing this manually, their accuracy usually is around the same percentage, which is about 85%, which is really, really good. So now a model that has not been fine-tuned off the shelf is able to achieve that same level of accuracy. That's very, very promising. Are there some gaps? Yes. And one of those gaps is this model, for example, in my case, this model is not domain adapted for healthcare. So it's literally using all the data that it gathered during during training, and it's using that knowledge to basically come up with these predictions that I was showcasing. Where opportunity comes into play is actually to use domain-specific models. These are models that have specifically been adapted, in this case, maybe for even patient matching or specifically for healthcare. And that might be where there's opportunity for that. Now, the good thing about Bedrock is Bedrock actually allows you to bring in your own custom model. That is something that from a developer point of view or engineering point of view is big, right? Because now you don't have to go and train your own model and be able to do domain adaptation yourself, be able to figure out how do I scale this model? How do I secure it? How do I build API layer on top of this model? How do I make sure the input is valid? How do I make sure that the data doesn't leak in a way that's not supposed to? All that is pre-baked into the Bedrock service itself. All you have to do is bring in your own model. And that, I'm pretty sure, is going to improve the accuracy, whereby at that point, it's going to beat the human level accuracy when it comes to clinical trials. So any more questions as far as, this or tracing? So you can see here refresh it. You can see here all the predictions that's happening. I'm capturing that, and I can be able to debug and see, okay, this is the input that was sent to the model and the output that came out of that.